Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Talk Speak podcast. Today, we're plugged into a truly vital and, well, constantly evolving cornerstone of Indo-Pacific security, the U.S. Japan Security Treaty.
Yeah, it's fundamental. We're going to trace its journey, from basically a post-war arrangement right up to the major alliance it is now.
Exactly. And we'll look at its impact across the region, think South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. But also, crucially, what are the limits? What are the internal pressures shaping it?
And this deep dive, it's really about giving you a solid, objective picture. We're focusing mainly on the last few years, say 2021 to 2024, because things have moved fast.
Right, but you can't understand that without the history. So we'll definitely dip back into earlier periods for that crucial context.
Absolutely. We're drawing on a strategic assessment report here. It looks at the treaty's evolution, its regional effects, like you mentioned, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, but also its own internal breaks and how it plays out in Japanese politics.
So some big questions we're hoping to tackle. How has it changed?
Right.
Really fundamentally changed.
And what does it actually mean today for the security of those other countries? South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. It's not abstract for them.
Definitely not. And what holds it back? What are the real-world limitations, and how does that affect Japan's role in the whole thing?
And we'll keep circling back to a few core ideas. First, the treaty's main job, really, is keeping the U.S. military present and influential in the Western Pacific.
Strategic dominance, essentially.
And providing security for Japan itself, of course, against potential threats. That's the baseline.
Okay. Second point.
Second, this alliance is seriously modernizing. It has to, given the Indo-Pacific security scene, especially, the challenges China poses.
And that modernization isn't just U.S. Japan anymore, is it?
No, not at all. It's increasingly about trilateral cooperation, bringing South Korea in, bringing the Philippines in. It's becoming more networked.
Interesting. And the third core argument?
That implementation, what Japan can actually do within the alliance, is really tied up with domestic stuff. You've got Article 9, the Peace Constitution.
Always Article 9.
Always. And the whole politics around U.S. bases in Japan, which is, well, complicated. Plus, deep-seated pacifist feelings and historical memory, it all plays a role.
Okay, that sets the stage really well. Let's dive right in at the beginning. The report starts with the origins of the old security treaty, 1951, post-war, Cold War kicking off. What was going on there?
Well, you have to picture the context. 1951, Japan had just renounced militarism in its new constitution. It basically had no real self-defense capability. Zero.
Right, completely demilitarized.
And then, bam, the Korean War starts. That really ramps up U.S. fears about communism spreading across Asia. Big time.
So the U.S. needed a foothold. A strategic spot.
Exactly. They needed to keep military bases in Japan to try and contain communist influence in the Far East. Japan was geographically crucial.
And from Japan's side, Prime Minister Yoshida.
Yoshida's thinking, it was pretty pragmatic. He figured relying on the U.S. for security meant Japan could pour all its energy into rebuilding its shattered economy. Let the U.S. handle defense, we'll handle recovery.
Makes sense from that perspective. But the report stresses this 1951 treaty was unequal. How so?
Oh, profoundly unequal. Article 1 gave the U.S. the right to station basically any forces, land, sea, air in Japan.
Okay.
And those forces were there to maintain international peace and security in the Far East. Pretty broad mandate.
And there was something else too, wasn't there? About internal issues.
Yes, the internal disorder clause. This was a big one. It basically said U.S. forces could, if Japan asked, help put down large-scale riots or disturbances inside Japan.
Wow. U.S. troops potentially policing Japan. That must have raised eyebrows.
Huge sovereignty concerns, absolutely. And then there's the defense commitment itself, or lack thereof.
What do you mean?
The 1951 treaty didn't actually explicitly say the U.S. had to defend Japan if it was attacked from outside. It implied it, maybe, by the presence of U.S. forces, but no clear obligation.
No ironclad guarantee.
Not in the text. Plus, Article 2 said Japan couldn't give base rights to any other country without U.S. permission.
Limiting their foreign policy options.
And no mechanism for prior consultation. The U.S. could pretty much do what it wanted with its forces based there without formally asking Japan first. It was very much a victor-vanquished dynamic still.
Okay, so clearly an unequal setup. That couldn't last forever, right?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the 1960 revision, the new security treaty. What drove that change?
Well, several things converged. Japan's economy was booming by the late 50s. Its international standing was rising, so naturally there was a push for a more equal footing with the
A
U.S.
desire for more respect, more reciprocity.
Definitely. And domestically, you had growing anti-base movements. People were unhappy about the U.S. military footprint. Incidents like the Sunagawa case, the Girard case, they really fueled public unease.
Right, friction between the bases and local communities.
And then regionally, the Second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958 really spooked Japan. It highlighted the risk of getting dragged into conflicts nearby.
So Japan felt vulnerable under the old treaty.
Yeah, there's a sense that the old treaty didn't quite fit the new reality or offer enough clarity and protection. All this built pressure for renegotiation.
And the result was the 1960 Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. What were the key upgrades? What really changed?
The absolute headline change was Article 5, Mutual Defense. For the first time, the treaty explicitly stated that an armed attack against Japan would be seen as dangerous to the U.S.'s own peace and safety.
Okay, that's huge.
It declared the U.S. would act to meet the common danger according to its own constitutional processes. That explicit commitment was the single most important development. An attack on Japan now meant essentially an attack involving the U.S.
A much clearer deterrence signal. What else was new?
The prior consultation mechanism, this was also critical. Article 6 still allowed the U.S. to use bases in Japan for Far East security.
But
An exchange of notes alongside the treaty, the Kishi Merchant Notes, required the U.S. to consult Japan beforehand on major troop deployments, major equipment changes, like bringing in nuclear weapons.
the nuclear issue, always sensitive.
Extremely. And also, crucially, consulting before using Japanese bases for combat operations not directly defending Japan. This gave Japan a real voice, a degree of control it didn't have before.
So more Japanese input on how U.S. forces there were used. And what about that internal disorder clause?
Gone. Deleted. Japan's internal situation was much more stable by 1960, and frankly, the clause was seen as an infringement on sovereignty. Removing it was important symbolically and practically.
And a time limit.
Yes, Article 10 set an initial 10-year validity period. After that, either side could terminate the treaty with 1 year's notice. It wasn't necessarily permanent, giving Japan a future escape hatch, theoretically.
Okay, these sound like major improvements for Japan, a more balanced relationship. But the report talks about this massive political upheaval, the security treaty struggle. Why such huge opposition if the treaty was better?
It was an absolutely massive political crisis, huge demonstrations unlike anything seen before. The opposition wasn't necessarily against an alliance, but against the strengthened alliance.
What were the specific fears?
The big fear was entrapment. That strengthening the ties would inevitably pull Japan into America's Cold War conflicts, especially potential hot wars nearby, like another Taiwan crisis or Vietnam, which was starting to heat up.
Fear of being dragged into U.S. wars.
Precisely. A fear that Japan would lose its post-war pacifist identity and just become a pawn in U.S. strategy. It tapped into deep anxieties about sovereignty, peace, and democracy.
And it got pretty intense, right? Didn't the prime minister resign?
Yes, the Kishi cabinet was ultimately forced to resign over the turmoil, but not before forcing the treaty through the Diet. It was incredibly divisive.
But despite that, the treaty stuck.
Yeah.
And the pro-treaty forces stayed in power.
They did. The Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, and others who supported the treaty maintained control for decades afterwards, really cementing the alliance as the bedrock of Japan's foreign policy. But that 1960 struggle left deep scars.
And you mentioned the Far East Clause in Article 6. That remained important.
Yes, defining the geographical scope of the Far East, where the treaty potentially applied, remained a key and sometimes ambiguous element.
How did they define it back then?
Prime Minister Kishi, in Diet Replies, gave an interpretation. He said it roughly includes the area north of the Philippines, Japan, and its surrounding areas, and also explicitly mentioned areas under South Korean and Republic of China, Taiwan jurisdiction at the time.
So Taiwan was included in that initial understanding.
In Kishi's interpretation, yes, though that interpretation itself has been debated and evolved over the years as the political map changed.
So the 1960 revision, it created a more equal treaty on paper, gave Japan that U.S. defense guarantee.
Right. Big steps forward.
But it still had underlying tensions, asymmetries.
Definitely. The mutuality was still asymmetrical because of Article 9. Japan simply couldn't offer the same kind of military backup to the U.S.
Constitutionally barred.
Exactly. And the U.S. still kept extensive base rights, which were vital for its global power projection, not just Japan's defense. And that 1960 struggle, it wasn't just about the treaty text. It was a fight over Japan's soul, really. Pacifism, democracy, sovereignty. all tangled up.
A defining moment in post-war history.
Yeah.
Okay, so the treaty itself was revised in 1960, but the alliance keeps evolving through these guidelines for defense cooperation. Can you walk us through those updates?
Sure. The guidelines are like the operational manual for the alliance. They spell out how the U.S. and Japan cooperate on defense specifics, and they've been updated to match changing times.
Starting with the first set.
1978, peak Cold War. The main threat perception was clearly the Soviet Union. So these guidelines focused on coordinating operations, intelligence, logistics, specifically for scenarios like peacetime, a direct attack on Japan, or...
So Far East contingencies.
Exactly. Major incidents in other areas of the Far East that could affect the security of Japan, still geographically focused on that region.
Okay, very Cold War specific. What happened after the wall came down?
Big changes. The Soviet threat disappeared, but new worries popped up. Korean Peninsula tensions didn't go away, and then the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis really focused minds.
A different kind of instability.
Right. So in 96, the U.S. and Japan issued a joint declaration reaffirming the alliance's importance after the Cold War and agreed to revise the 78 guidelines. That led to the 1997 new guidelines.
And the key concept there was?
Situations in areas surrounding Japan. This was a crucial shift.
How was it different from Far East contingencies?
It was deliberately less about fixed geography and more about the nature of the situation. Situations occurring in areas surrounding Japan that have an important impact on Japan's peace and security. It was situational, not geographical.
So potentially broader, but also maybe more ambiguous.
Exactly. And under these 97 guidelines, Japan's role was mainly rear area support for the U.S. military supplies, transport, medical, base access. Plus non-combat stuff like search and rescue, ship inspections. It expanded Japan's support role significantly.
More involved, but still largely non-combat support. And then another update in 2015. What prompted that?
The pace of change just kept accelerating. China's military modernization was really kicking into high gear, much more maritime activity.
East China Sea, South China Sea.
North Korea's nuclear and missile programs kept advancing. And new threats to terrorism, piracy, cyber, space, the whole security environment got way more complex.
So the 2015 guidelines needed to reflect that complexity.
Right. The goal was a more resilient, flexible alliance capable of responding globally, not just regionally. A key idea was achieving seamless cooperation, getting rid of those old divisions like peacetime, surrounding situations, Japan contingency.
Making the response smoother, faster.
Yeah, and broader. Cooperation explicitly expanded globally and into new domains. Missile defense, space, cyber, ISR, logistics, even helping build capacity in other countries.
And this linked into Japan's new security laws passed around then.
Absolutely. The 2015 guidelines incorporated Japan's ability, under its new security legislation, to provide broader logistical support, including to forces other than the U.S. in what were now called important influence situations. Again, situational, not geographic.
And new mechanisms for coordination.
Yes, the Alliance Coordination Mechanism, ACM, and the Bilateral Planning Mechanism, BPM, were set up to really boost policy coordination and joint planning, both day-to-day and for crises.
So a constant process of adaptation, moving towards a broader scope, deeper integration, and more flexible response criteria based on the situation, not just the map.
That's a good summary. Each revision reflected the changing threats and Japan's gradually evolving, albeit still constrained, security role.
Okay, that's a fantastic overview of the evolution up to the mid-2010s. Let's pivot now to the really recent stuff, 2021 to 2024. The report talks about significant alliance modernization. What does that actually involve on the ground?
Well, first off, you see way more high-level meetings, constant consultations, and the focus is increasingly, almost explicitly, on dealing with the challenges posed by China across the board.
So China is the main driver now.
It's certainly a primary driver in the modernization push. Joint statements constantly reiterate commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific, the rules-based order.
Code for countering China's influence.
Largely, yes. They explicitly mention concerns about China's actions in the East and South China Seas, Taiwan Strait, even human rights issues. So to meet this, they've launched concrete modernization initiatives. One big one is command and control integration.
Integration, not just cooperation.
Exactly. The 2024 leader statement talked about upgrading their respective command structures for seamless integration of operations and capabilities. Better interoperability, better joint planning. It's a shift from just working with each other to working as one, ideally.
Deeper military fusion. What else?
Defense industry cooperation is another big push. They set up this DICUS forum, Defense Industrial Cooperation, Acquisition, and Sustainment.
Catchy name. What's it for?
Basically pooling their industrial strengths. Co-developing and producing missiles is a priority. Also, things like jointly maintaining U.S. warships and fighter jets, using Japanese commercial shipyards and facilities.
Leveraging Japan's industrial base for U.S. forward presence.
Right. And intertwined with that is strengthening Japan's own capabilities. The U.S. strongly supports Japan's moves here.
Like the defense budget increase.
Yeah.
Aiming for 2% of GDP.
Exactly. And the decision to acquire counterattack capabilities, the ability to hit enemy bases, plus setting up a permanent joint HQ for the self-defense forces. The U.S. has pledged to help Japan effectively use those new counterattack capabilities.
So Japan steps up its own defense, and the U.S. supports and integrates with that.
And they're tackling high-end threats together, too, like hypersonic missiles. They're working jointly on the Glide Phase Interceptor, the GPI program, to counter that.
Cutting-edge defense tech cooperation.
And cooperation in new domain space, cyber is expanding rapidly. Plus, always the reaffirmation of U.S. extended deterrence, including the nuclear umbrella, as vital for Japan's security.
It's a very comprehensive push across military, industrial, and technological lines. Okay, let's look at the ripple effects. South Korea, how does all this U.S.-Japan strengthening impact Seoul?
It's complex for South Korea, but the biggest recent change is definitely the warming of U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral security cooperation. It's really taken off lately.
What's driving that thaw? Because relations haven't always been smooth.
Shared threats, primarily. North Korea is the most obvious and immediate one. Its nuclear and missile programs worry both Tokyo and Seoul intensely.
A common enemy focuses the mind.
It does. And China's increasing military clout and economic pressure in the region also pushes them closer together, creating common concerns.
Despite the historical baggage.
Issues from Japan's colonial rule are still a huge obstacle, always simmering beneath the surface. But the shared threat perception, particularly under recent administrations in Seoul, has led to more pragmatic cooperation joint drills, intel sharing on North Korea.
But it's still a balancing act for South Korea.
A very delicate one. They need the U.S. alliance, they see value in cooperating with Japan on security, but China is their biggest trading partner. They have to tread carefully. So while trilateralism is up, it's potentially fragile depending on politics and how Seoul weighs those competing interests.
Okay, a pragmatic alignment driven by threats but constrained by history and economics. Now, Taiwan, the report says it's become an increasingly clear focus. How has that shift happened?
Taiwan's prominence on the alliance agenda has shot up. It wasn't really mentioned explicitly in top-level joint statements until the 2021 U.S. Japan Summit.
That was the first time.
First time in a summit statement in decades. Since then, almost every major meeting, 2+2 talks, summits emphasizes the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and encourages peaceful resolution. It's become standard language.
And beyond the statements, are they planning for contingencies?
Discussion about Taiwan contingencies has exploded in Japan. Across the board, government, think tanks, media, there's a real growing sense that Taiwan's security is directly linked to Japan's own security.
Why the shift? Geography.
Geography is huge. Taiwan is incredibly close to Japan's southwestern islands, like Okinawa and the Sakishima chain. Vital sea lanes run through there.
And those islands host key U.S. and Japanese bases.
Exactly. Plus, you see the PLA's constant military activity around Taiwan, the military balance shifting. Japan feels that if conflict breaks out over Taiwan, it's highly likely to spill over onto Japanese territory.
So it's become a direct national security concern, not just a regional issue.
Very much so. And historically, remember, Kishi's interpretation of the Far East Clause back in the 60s included Taiwan. And the 97 surrounding situations concept was widely seen as potentially covering a Taiwan crisis. Then Japan's 2015 security laws created a framework for intervening, potentially, if a situation severely impacted Japan's peace and security. So Taiwan's gone from being sort of implicitly covered to being a central scenario planners are focused on.
But that focus doesn't mean automatic Japanese military involvement if something happens.
Absolutely crucial point. No. While the focus signals alignment and raises the stakes, how Japan might get involved depends on the specific scenario, the political decision in Tokyo at the time, the interpretation of Article 9.
The hurdles are still there.
They are. Japan's initial role would likely be logistical support, base access for U.S. forces, maybe non-combatant evacuation. Direct combat involvement faces high legal and political barriers. So while Taiwan might welcome the increased attention, relying solely on Japanese intervention would be risky. Bolstering their own defenses remains key.
Understood. Let's bring in the Philippines. They seem to be playing a bigger role in this regional picture, too, with U.S. Japan Philippines trilateral cooperation taking shape.
Definitely. The Philippines has become much more strategically important in the alliance's thinking, especially under the Marcos Jr. administration, which has pivoted back towards stronger ties with the U.S. and actively sought deeper security links with Japan.
So political alignment opened the door.
It did. And it led to a rapid formation of this trilateral framework. You see regular meetings now between defense ministers, national security advisors, foreign ministers, even leaders. They're trying to coordinate policy much more closely.
And the main driver here seems to be
the South China Sea. Without a doubt, China's assertive actions, harassing Philippine vessels, building and militarizing features, that's put the Philippines under immense pressure.
And the U.S. and Japan see that as a challenge to the regional order.
Yes. They see it as challenging freedom of navigation, unilaterally changing the status quo by force or coercion. So, trilateral statements strongly condemn this, reject illegal maritime claims, and call on China to abide by the 2016 arbitration ruling.
What does this cooperation look like in practice?
Several levels. Enhanced maritime security work, more joint Coast Guard and naval exercises, plans for joint patrols.
Okay.
Capacity building for the Philippines, U.S. and Japan are providing equipment, training, tech to help modernize the Philippine military and Coast Guard.
Helping them stand up for themselves more.
Right. Military access is key, too. The U.S. has gained access to more Philippine bases under EDCA, and Japan and the Philippines are negotiating a reciprocal access agreement, an RAA, which would make it easier for their forces to train and operate in each other's territory.
Facilitating joint operations.
And it's not just military. They're cooperating on economic and tech security, too. Supporting infrastructure development like the Luzon Economic Corridor, working on critical minerals, clean energy, semiconductors, trying to build resilience and reduce reliance on China.
A pretty broad-based trilateral partnership, then, driven by shared concerns about China in the South China Sea.
Exactly. For the U.S., it strengthens the first island chain strategy. For Japan, it helps secure vital sea lanes and gives it a bigger regional security role. For the Philippines, it brings crucial support and leverage vis-a-vis China. But, like the South Korea case, domestic politics in the Philippines could shift things down the line.
Always a factor. Now, the report also highlights joint military exercises as a key tool for the alliance. What's significant about those?
They're crucial for showing strength, improving how forces work together, and, frankly, sending deterrent messages.
What kinds of exercises? What's the focus?
There's a big focus on island defense, amphibious operations, clearly relevant to East China Sea scenarios, maybe South China Sea too. Also maritime security, high-end stuff like missile defense, cyber, space, and logistics, making sure they can sustain operations together.
And these are getting bigger, more complex.
Definitely. The scale and intensity are increasing. That's a deliberate signal, especially towards China, about the alliance's readiness and capability.
And involving civilian elements now, too.
Yeah, that's a newer trend. Using civilian airports and ports in exercises, involving local governments and evacuation drills, it shows they're thinking beyond just military response to the broader societal impact of a potential conflict, planning for resilience.
And other countries are joining in sometimes, Europeans.
Yes, seeing the UK, France, Germany, others participating more in Indo-Pacific exercises highlights this growing sense that security in Europe and Asia is linked. Shared concerns about challenges to the international order, mainly from China and Russia. It signals a broader democratic alignment.
Okay, so the alliance is actively strengthening itself and its partnerships. But let's talk constraints. The report calls Article 9 the fundamental shackle. Can you unpack that again in this context?
It really is the bedrock constraint. Article 9 renounces war and prohibits war potential. While governments have interpreted it to allow self-defense forces for individual self-defense under the principle of exclusively defensive defense, its core spirit deeply limits Japan's ability to use force overseas or participate fully in collective security.
Even with the 2015 reinterpretation allowing limited collective self-defense.
Even then, the hurdles remain incredibly high. Japan can't just send troops to fight alongside the U.S. whenever the U.S. gets involved somewhere. The situation has to directly threaten Japan's own survival or have a critical impact under very strict legal definitions, survival-threatening situation, or important influence situation.
Very high bars to clear.
Extremely high. So in most plausible regional conflicts, say Taiwan or the South China Sea, Japan's role is constitutionally pushed towards logistics, base access, maybe intelligence support, rather than direct combat. Article 9 creates this inherent strategic ambiguity about what Japan can and will do.
Which impacts planning and deterrence.
It has to. Allies can't be 100% certain of the extent of Japanese involvement in every scenario, and potential adversaries might perceive that ambiguity as a weakness or hesitation. It's a permanent source of legal and political complexity for the alliance.
Okay, another limitation mentioned is the boundaries of definition. The scope of cooperation getting vaguer over time.
Yeah, there's been that shift we talked about. From the relatively clear geographical Far East Clause interpretation in the 60s to the more situational surrounding situations in 97, and then important influence situations in 2015.
Moving away from map lines to judging the nature of the crisis.
Exactly. Which sounds flexible, and it is, but it also means the decision to act in a crisis isn't automatic. It becomes a major political judgment call for the Japanese government at the time.
What's the downside of that?
It puts immense pressure on the government to decide. Does this specific event meet the threshold? That decision will involve politics, public opinion, legal debates. It might not be quick.
Potential for hesitation or delay.
That's the risk. Instead of a clear trigger leading to a predictable response, you have a potentially time-consuming political process right when speed might be essential. This could affect the alliance's responsiveness and maybe even its deterrent credibility.
Flexibility versus decisiveness. A potential trade-off.
Yeah.
And the final constraint, base politics. The U.S. bases are essential, but also controversial.
Absolutely essential physically for the treaty to function. They're the forward presence. But they've always been a complex, sensitive issue, especially in Okinawa, where the concentration is incredibly high.
Bearing a disproportionate burden.
Hugely, leading to decades of local opposition, concerns about noise, safety, accidents, environmental impact, crimes by U.S. personnel. It's a long list of grievances.
And the Status of Forces Agreement, the SOFA, is often a flashpoint.
Yes, particularly the rules around criminal jurisdiction. When U.S. personnel commit crimes off base, the procedures are often seen by the Japanese public as favoring the U.S. military, not fully respecting Japanese law or sovereignty. There are constant calls to revise SOFA.
So it's not just a local issue.
No, it's a major national political issue. Governments are always trying to balance the strategic need for the bases, as they see it, with the strong local demands to reduce the burden. The whole Futenma Air Base relocation saga in Okinawa is the poster child for how difficult this is. The bases are vital operationally, but they're also a source of constant political friction and a potential vulnerability for the alliance if mishandled.
Okay, so significant constraints from the Constitution, the definitions, and the bases. Let's finally turn to the domestic impact in Japan. How has the treaty shaped Japanese politics itself?
Well, at the mainstream level, supporting the U.S. alliance has been the default position for decades, especially for the ruling LDP.
The cornerstone of foreign policy.
Pretty much. But you can't forget the huge divide back in 1960. While opposition parties have mostly accepted the alliance's reality now, there are still real differences in emphasis across the spectrum. How close the ties should be, Japan's specific role, Article 9, defense spending, the bases, those debates haven't vanished.
And how do public opinion, historical memory, and base politics feed into that?
It's a complex mix. Public opinion polls generally show majority support for the alliance itself. People see it as necessary for security.
Right.
But there's also widespread unease about the base burden, especially in Okinawa, concerns about SOFA, and fears of entrapment in U.S. conflicts. Pacifism, rooted in the trauma of World War II, still runs deep. Any talk of expanding the military's role or changing Article 9 is instantly controversial because of that historical memory.
So support for the alliance, but skepticism about its costs and risks.
Well, that's a good way to put it. And the anti-base sentiment, particularly in Okinawa, is a constant political force that politicians have to reckon with. These factors, public opinion, history, bases, all swirl together and shape the political conversation around the treaty.
And finally, how has the treaty directly influenced Japan's defense policy choices? Budget, capabilities, the constitutional debate.
Hugely influential, often decisive. Japan's recent push to increase defense spending towards that 2% GDP target, that's happening largely within the alliance framework, driven partly by U.S. expectations for burden sharing and the shared perception of a worsening security environment.
So the alliance provides the context and maybe some pressure.
Exactly. The same goes for acquiring new capabilities like counterattack potential, bolstering defenses in the Southwest Islands, investing in cyber. These moves enhance Japan's own defense, but also its contribution to the alliance.
But this expansion creates tension with Article 9.
Always. Every step towards a more robust defense role inevitably bumps up against Article 9's constraints, fueling the ongoing debate about whether the Constitution needs amending to match reality.
Does the alliance make pushing those changes easier for the government?
It often provides what you might call external pressure or a legitimacy framework. It can be politically easier to justify defense policy changes by framing them as necessary for strengthening the alliance and meeting commitments, rather than purely as a unilateral Japanese initiative. The alliance context shapes the entire defense policy debate.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it's clear the U.S. Japan Security Treaty is absolutely central to Indo-Pacific security. It's constantly changing, adapting to new threats.
But always operating within real constraints, constitutional, political, social. It's a dynamic system, constantly balancing strategic needs against domestic realities and regional sensitivities.
That's it exactly. The alliance faces ongoing challenges, balancing its strategic goals with domestic constraints, allied expectations, and the need to avoid escalating regional tensions. Where do you see this delicate balance being tested most acutely in the next decade?
That's a big question, isn't it?
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.